Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to some of you. Thank you very much for taking the time to join this half an hour RSA replacement webinar today. The plan will be to have myself, my name is Bradley Lewington, I am the immediate account manager here at SecureAuth, and my colleague James Romer, who is the Chief Security Architect, run through some of the common challenges of RSA, how we address that, and then we'll move on to a Q&A at the end. Just as some general ground rules, you will all be muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions during or after the webinar itself, please do submit those questions via the Q&A panel, and we will look at answering those questions at the end of the presentation. Slides and recordings will be sent out later this week, and if you have any queries on this webinar, please do contact us at the given address. Just as a side note, please do stick around towards the end of the seminar, as we will have some more details on how we can financially aid you in the replacement of RSA should you choose to do so. So, as I just previously stated, I actually previously worked for RSA. I worked specifically within their authentication team here in the UK. And so what I really wanted to quickly run through is some of the challenges that were brought to me by customers that I had dealt with in the past. So first is that RSA is strong in the sense of it has a high level of security, but what it does lack is in the usability, both from an end user perspective, but also from a management perspective. So a lot of the feedback that I had in the past was that software and hardware token management was rather labor intensive, expensive from a logistical perspective, and also could be quite confusing at times. One of the biggest problems with tokens themselves, especially hardware tokens, is that they expire. This is traditionally said to ease the auditing purposes for stock. However, with people now providing non-expiring software tokens and non-expiring hardware tokens, this has sort of been put to bed, so to speak. There's a heavy help desk workload with RSA, just due to the fact that there's very minimal self-service tools that are integrated into customer environments, which means most queries of lost tokens would be passed straight to the help desk and increasing on an already heavy workload. Next, we have the rigidity in the actual solutions that it can support across the traditionally sort of used solutions within a corporate organization. So VPN and ADFS is really a strong point for RSA. However, moving onwards towards newer technologies such as single sign-on, software as a service applications, and also traditional applications, there was a lot more work needed with SDK to really pull those utilities into an RSA workflow. There was no simple way of doing this. Going back to user experience, there was no flexibility. It was every single time, regardless of who you were, where you were working from, or what you were looking to access, you would have to use a token code every single time. There was no biometric authentication, no modern mobile authentication. It was just tokens. And even now, I believe it's just software tokens that you can use. So again, it's still very rigid workflows for end users to deal with. The approach that we try and take is that we actually want it to be easier to use than your traditional 2FA, and in ideal circumstances, your users aren't actually aware that their user account is being scrutinized and should only really have an interruption if between you and our solution there is a significant amount of risk deemed whilst your users are logging on to any given resource. And going back to the SDK kits needed for certain types of integrations, we sit as a black box appliance within existing infrastructure, and we point our tool towards existing infrastructure, such as identity sources, to pull in to the authentication workflows to help build the picture of risk associated to a user. So from a very high level, we have multi-layered risk analysis, which my colleague James Romer will go on to show you shortly, which will only require an MFA step if necessary. We have single sign-on to give you or your users a single place of accessing applications and resources. And lastly, we have user self-service. So this is basic account management, password reset, again, just to try and take that load off of the help desk. As we know, there's a high cost association when it comes to authentication and access technologies to help desks within corporate environments. I want to hand over to my colleague James Romer, who is the Chief Security Architect, to run you through some of the more in detail how we address the challenges with RSA.
Okay, thank you, Bradley, and good afternoon, everybody. So, as Bradley mentioned, one of the great benefits of being able to analyze risk and the user's context is the ability to improve usability and also increase security. So how does SecureAuth approach this problem? Well, we provide very rich pre-authentication risk analysis through a layered approach. I'm going to go very quickly through the layers and then just talk around some of those layers in a bit more detail as we go. But really, it's about creating a true context, a true picture of a user, in a real-time manner, and therefore being able to make a decision around that user before we get to the authentication challenge. And that is really important to stress. This is moving away from a static 2FA experience, which is heavy on friction. We're talking here about creating a dynamic, risk-based authentication experience where we can present an authentication option that we as a business and as a solution think is appropriate for that user in a real-time manner. So we start, traditionally looking at some common points to build up this risk score, and I'll start here on the screen with the first layer, if you like, as we see. And that's device recognition. And just to quickly say that as we go down these layers, they can actually be utilized in any order, in any combination. You could be using 2 or 3 layers. You could be using all 10 of these layers. But I'll just touch on them in the order they are on the screen. But just bear in mind it could be in different combinations. So as I say, we start with device recognition. A very easy indicator of risk is, do we trust the device? Have we seen the device before within the enterprise, within the organization? Has the user gone through a strong multi-factor authentication process from that device before? And if they have, we have the ability to construct a unique device fingerprint and essentially use that the next time the user comes in as a level and indicator of trust and therefore lowering the risk. Because we can lower the risk based on device recognition, we can reduce the friction. So this is really typically a starting point, but it is just an indicator of risk. It could be enough for an organization to be happy that we can reduce the friction completely, or it may be that we need to go through some more layers to continue to build up this strength and depth approach to adjust the user experience accordingly. So we'll go down to the next layer, as it's shown on the screen. And SecureAuth provides a very rich threat service. This is real-time threat intelligence. This allows an organization to essentially detect actionable information as it's happening, as access requests are coming into your organization. We have the capabilities to be able to inform an organization whether an access attempt is coming from behind an anonymous network, for instance, such as a Tor browser, or maybe an anonymous VPN or transparent proxy. Or equally as important, whether an IP that has been used for an access request has a poor reputation or a high-risk reputation because they've been involved in malicious activity in the past, maybe cyber espionage or hacktivism. Whatever it may be, this is a very, very rich level of intelligence that we apply to the pre-authentication workflow. So immediately, a business can actually start to make decisions. I, for instance, as a business, do not want anonymous network attempts to come into my organization. We don't want malicious activity to be hidden behind anonymous networks, so let's just block that at source. So we're starting to build up a picture here based on real intelligence information. We're making that information actionable. We're also, of course, writing this information into your security syslog SIM tools, so you can correlate it and create policy based on activity. But essentially, we're now giving you that visibility, and this is all before we're presenting the authentication challenge. So as we go down these layers, we're building up that real bulletproof vest, defense in depth approach. We go to the next layer, for any security vendor doing identity assurance, identity proofing stages, we need to obviously be able to use data that's held within the enterprise data stores. So SecureAuth can go across any structured data. It could be your common Active Directory data stores, but it could be any combination of Active Directory, other LDAPs, or SQL, or Oracle, or web services, JDBC, ODBC, whatever that organization works, wherever they store their data, their personal, their PII data for their end users, we can work with those data stores to create a very rich virtual profile of a user real time. So this allows us to look at group, memberships, attributes, entitlement, roles, etc., etc. All about creating this rich picture and a decision tree, decision point. This allows us to look at the risk around that user. We then start to look at more granular controls around movement of users. So geolocation being the most common. Is the access request coming from a location, a country that we trust? That's a very simple rule, and it's very easy to implement. And just very quickly on that note, it is also very easy to get around on its own in isolation. So where you have organizations implementing geolocation rules, of course, you also have access requests coming from behind anonymous networks to get around those geolocation rules. So it's important that you complement your geolocation rules by utilizing a threat service. We can therefore block the anonymous access attempts and make those geolocation rules far stronger, far harder to get around. So that's where we talk about using these layers in combination to create this strength in depth. We go a stage further then and look at Geo Velocity rules and improbable travel events. My normal access patterns and my normal behavior, I would log in from my home office or my work office in London, for instance, in the UK, at 9 o'clock in the morning. If, for whatever reason, an hour later, my identity, an access attempt is made using my identity in America, in New York, for argument's sake, of course, I can't possibly get between those 2 points in that amount of time. Therefore, we need to be able to do something about that activity. We need to make that information actionable. It could be blocking the access attempt in New York. It could be actually just writing that information into the SIM so the security teams can actually do something about it. The important thing is we're making it real, we're making it actionable. We can take it even further and start talking about region control, so geofencing, putting barriers around travel within regions themselves. So we talk about a radius of activity, a 50-mile-an-hour radius. My identity can log in, very low friction within that boundary. As soon as I step outside of that perimeter, then the friction may go up, or we may be blocking the access completely. It's about giving control now to the enterprise about where their identities can actually log in from. And again, just to reiterate, this is before the authentication challenge. So you're getting a lot of rich information here, a lot of granularity, and therefore you're protecting the authentication methods before you present them. We also pull in fraud prevention feeds. So when we talk about common authentication methods and mechanisms, typically you're talking really around ease of use. So SMS OTP, voice OTP delivered to handsets and landlines. Of course, very easy to deploy. Most organizations have corporate mobile devices or even BYOD. But even landlines, receiving a voice OTP to your desk phone, whatever it may be, they're very easy to deploy these methods. But you still need to put intelligence in front of these methods. So SecureAuth pulls in phone number fraud prevention intelligence, and therefore we can allow an organization to run those numbers through these checks before we send any OTPs out to a mobile number or to a landline. So we're looking for things such as the device carrier. Is it a device carrier the organization uses? Is it a device class that you want to send an OTP to? We're not going to send OTPs to virtual numbers necessarily, for instance. It's going to be a physical real mobile phone or a physical real landline. We can also tell whether a phone number has been ported recently. These are classic indicators of risk, and therefore it's important we can feed that into the authentication workflow before showing the authentication option to an end user. If we think a phone number is high risk and it's failing on some of these checks, then the user won't see the authentication option for SMS or voice OTP delivery. Okay, I'll keep going down here. Behavioral biometrics is a great layer for SecureAuth to be able to go a bit further into an application. And so we're talking here more around high-risk applications where continuous authentication is of interest. So a user may have authenticated using an adaptive process, strong authentication, two-factor. But once they're actually in the application, we can look at the way they type, their rhythm, their sequence, their flight across the keyboard, and also the way they use their mouse to learn about their normal behavioral biometric profiling within an application. So the way you move between fields, the way you type, etc. That is unique to every person. That allows us to say with confidence that actually, yes, we authenticated you, and yes, we still believe it's that person using the application. If we, for whatever reason, detect that the user using the application is no longer the same user who the profile is matched against, then we can actually step the user up, ask them to prove themselves again, or block them, log them out completely. So it's another great piece of information that we can utilize, applicable, as I say, into very high-risk applications, financial applications. We also talk about creating an ecosystem. So any security vendor should be working with all the data sets we can get. We should not be working as a silo. So we're very keen to work with, for instance, governance tools, best-of-breed governance tools, any data sets with compliance, entitlements, matrices, tools such as SailPoint. We can get risk scores from those products to allow us to make a decision, to allow us to further the authentication experience, be that reducing friction or increasing friction. You know, classic ones would be a user trying to authenticate who has high access rights in a particular system, maybe admin privileges. That may change the journey for their authentication process, or they may be in violation of a segregation of duty policy. Of course, that's very high risk, and therefore they could be blocked access, depending on you know, their context in that time. But this is about feeding that information into the authentication flow to enhance the decision. We do the same with the UBA tools, and those UBA tools have done a great job of baselining access and then looking for spikes and anomalies. We can utilize that great information, again, as part of the authentication flow to lower the friction if the access patterns are completely normal and in line with that baseline, or equally introduce higher friction if there's a spike, if there's an anomaly, if there's actually something unusual happening. We can change the experience. So this is all about creating that overarching risk score to drive the user authentication journey. This is all pre-authentication typically. So we put that all together and we get this rich story. There's one example I just want to give you here, specifically focusing on the threat service. One example of a customer of ours who deployed the threat service, and within 3 weeks, you know, they had detected, as it says on the screen here, 7,130 suspicious logins. These suspicious logins were prevented by SecureAuth, and we broke that down into categories. And the important thing to focus on here is the 7,103 suspicious logins came from anonymous networks. That's in line with our previous research and research that you can get from the internet that's publicly available. You know, over 90% of malicious requests come from behind anonymous networks. So it makes absolute sense as a security vendor, authentication vendor, to be able to block those requests at source. That immediately increases the security of the authentication request because you're just knocking out all of those bad access attempts at source. Okay, and because we're doing that, we're actually changing potentially the user journey, the user experience at all stages. So that classic static 2FA challenge that the user sees, guess what? The hackers also see that static challenge as well. So they go after the low-hanging static 2FA approaches, and also where username and passwords are obviously deployed on their own in a single factor, the hackers go after those. By analyzing risk, you can move completely away from any knowledge-based element. You therefore increase the security and increase the usability. But importantly, you're giving the options to the organization to utilize these real actionable pieces of information, change the user experience. If we detect something unusual, we're not going to show that static 2FA every time, because the bad actors will go after those static 2FA processes, and we see it happening. So it's very important that we can adapt. We can also remove the weak points, such as passwords, completely to enrich the user experience. Of course, removing passwords is a great way of enriching user experience, but also at the same time increase the security. So just to sort of finish up on how this sort of plays out when we talk about utilizing those risk checks and we get to the authentication phase, if you like, we're introducing the friction only if we need to. And it could be that your use case, your business case requires friction every time. but it doesn't necessarily need to be the same authentication option every time. Equally, we can reduce the friction based on previous use, the baselines that we're getting from maybe a UBA tool, but also our own access history patterns that we detect and compile. We can equally allow organizations to present the best options to their end users. So SecureAuth provides over 25 authentication options, and of course all of the classics you would expect. I've mentioned voice OTP, SMS OTP, but we do more modern techniques such as link to accept, symbol to accept, push to accept, the nice user experience. We also have the capability, as I mentioned, to go passwordless completely, be that on-premise applications, be that cloud applications, whatever the use case is. SecureAuth can utilize this adaptive engine, these risk layers, these risk checks, to really remove the friction where necessary and increase it dynamically where necessary. And as part of that, we can support existing estates such as RSA hard tokens. So of course, you know, where you've invested heavily in RSA hard tokens, we can utilize that existing investment. This is not about ripping and replacing. This is about giving you options, and you may have use cases where you always need a hard token. That may be a very valid business requirement. You may have no cell phone coverage. You may not allow phones into particular areas of your business, and therefore a hard token is perfect for that. So yes, let's utilize them. But let's give you a choice. Let's give you a migration path away. So we have this capability of supporting those existing tokens where they're deployed, but also giving users more options. So, you know, today they use the hard token, but tomorrow they want to actually utilize the soft token through the SecureAuth app, or the nice link to accept workflows through the SMS and voice telephony channels to their regular corporate device, whatever it may be. This is about providing the choice, supporting your existing investment, and giving you the dynamic authentication experience based on risk. Okay, so thank you very much. I just wanted to tie that all together as well. The SecureAuth solution is a true platform-based solution. So when I talk about these adaptive authentication options and risk-based controls, we're talking about a solution that's based on standards, so SAML, OpenID Connect, OAuth2, WSFed, WSTrust. This allows us to do the great redirection, so to become an authentication broker, to go through the strong authentication, multi-factor, and adaptive checks that I've spoken about, and therefore also provide the single sign-on. So the great advantage of being able to prove the user, being able to adapt to real-time risk, is also the ability to issue tokens through, and issue the SSO, again creating a nice user experience, but only doing that when we have that confidence that the user is who they say they are. Because we're doing that, we can deliver a lot of power back to the end users through self-service. So the self-service password resets, the account unlocks, the profile management, the ability to provision into applications, all of these traditional things that put burdens on help desk. SecureAuth gives you the framework and the workflows out of the box to give the power to the end user, because we're proving the user and we're analyzing in real time to make sure they are who they say they are at all times. And the last thing I really want to mention on this is SecureAuth is a true platform. This is not a combination of many different products. This is not a Frankenstein. This is one platform that solves all those needs, and because it's authentication with SSO, with self-service, it's important that it all functions and works together as a true platform. And so therefore, when we create tokens, we're in control of those users within the applications as well. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to hand you back to Bradley now for him to wrap up.
Thank you, James. So, as a very brief summary, we are able to address the common challenges via non-expiring MFA methods with no additional costs compared to traditional tokens. We have a full help desk service suite included with password reset, account unlocking, etc., as basic profile management as well. We're able to integrate with VPN, ADFS, software as a service applications and environments, as well as providing single sign-on to manage large-scale applications or large amounts of applications for users. And lastly, we can really provide flexible workflows to really try and stay out of the way of your end users as much as possible and to create as little friction as possible. So next steps, as I said earlier, we'll be sending out these slides by the end of this week. We'll also be following up with some calls to get some feedback with a view that if viable to have a more in-depth demonstration with myself and James Romer to give you a real walkthrough of the platform and to give you a chance to ask any particularly specific questions. And lastly, I wanted to mention that we're actually able to try and alleviate some of the financial burden on RSA. I understand from my history there that maintenance is something that most people just tend to just renew yearly. What we can do is potentially look at providing some sort of rebate or discount based on the value of the maintenance that you have left on your existing contract to, again, alleviate that financial burden away from RSA. So we're now going to move on to the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to populate the Q&A panel with those. We do have quite a few here at the moment. So we have one here, which is, how does this differ from RSA's risk-based authentication? James, did you want to take the lead on this one?
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, SecureAuth is a platform solution. So this isn't a case of having to deploy additional infrastructure to support the adaptive capabilities. Having said that, the adaptive capabilities within SecureAuth are very rich, far richer than the adaptive capabilities that RSA provide, and also the ability to then present and protect authentication options is something that RSA struggle with. We have the 25+ authentication options, and any of those options can be chosen based on that risk score, the ability to pull in information through threat service, the ability to complement your Geo rules through our threat service. These are all things that are unique to the SecureAuth adaptive authentication platform, and then that decision process, decision tree, and workflow flexibility based around that risk-based engine is what gives us the strength to actually give you the best authentication experience and therefore the best user experience. It's the flexibility around the whole product that makes it so unique.
Thank you, James. I'll just touch on that in that the RSA risk-based authentication only takes in two real variables, which is the device profile and keystrokes. Essentially, those are the two factors that it takes into place to generate an element of risk to an account, whereas, as James just said, we have a large number of different variables to provide as high accuracy as possible. I believe we've just had another one come in. So how do we compare to SecureID access with RSA being able to leverage SSO capabilities along with MFA methods? James, do you want to take that one?
Well, again, it's a case of, yes, it's another product within the RSA set. How well do those products work together? How hard is it to get them to talk together? And, once you're in through an authentication experience with a token, what happens then? Who's in control? Do they hand it off to the application? Do they still have visibility? Can they still do real-time checks? Can they still step you up, step you down based on context changes? I would sincerely doubt it that the problem with having discrete applications, discrete products, is you're not in control of token issuance. You have to be a platform, you have to be a true access control platform to be able to do that, to provide the best journey, the best authentication option, but remain in control. That's what the main difference is.
Fantastic. Thank you, James. I think maybe we'll have time for one last question. We have one here, which is, what's the impact on performance with so many layers? Do I have to use all of the risk layers?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question. So there's very minimal impact on performance. These are all web calls, milliseconds essentially. And no, you don't have to use all the layers. You can essentially use a combination of layers that work for your business rule and the application you're trying to access. Some of those layers aren't relevant, of course, if you're internal. Those layers become more relevant if you're external, such as the threat service, for instance, and geolocation rules, etc. So it's very much a case of utilizing the layers that work for the context of the application, but the actual user experience is not degraded at all. This is, as I say, web calls.
Fantastic. Thank you, James. So I believe that is all we have time for. We have hit the half-an-hour mark. Again, if you have any separate questions, the email address will be on the text that will be sent out. Thank you very much again, everyone, for taking the time to attend this webinar. And yeah, hopefully we'll be speaking to you within the next few days.